Changes to the non-residency rules foreign income for taxpayers post 1 July 2009. Basically, up until 30th of June 2009, if you work overseas on wages, even though you're an Australian resident, you've got a job overseas, typically the person who does this works in the mining industry. Countries that are worked in are often in Africa or in Central Asia. You get paid overseas so long as you're being taxed overseas and you meet certain conditions about being in that location for a period of at least 3 months. Then all of your income overseas is effectively exempt from Australian tax. There is a particular rule that governs how that so-called exempt income affects your Australian tax, and this is known as exemption in progression. So effectively, the most someone working overseas had to worry about, so long as they were employed and were there for more than 3 months, is that their overseas income could affect their Australian rate of tax. But if they had no income in Australia at all, and all their income was from overseas and it was taxed at source, they would not pay any Australian tax. Now effectively this was a pretty good deal for a lot of taxpayers because the tax overseas was often very low. Particularly in Africa and in Central Asia, the tax regime was often very generous, and not a lot of tax was paid here in Australia on account of these rules. Effectively you're exempt. Unfortunately, the budget announcement in May 2009 is effectively removing this concession, and it's only really leaving it in place for a fairly select group of people, taxpayers who work for charities, government type relief organisations, etc. It's a pretty restricted group. The basic thrust of the new rules is simply to say that if you work overseas on wages, then effectively you will be taxed in Australia at the normal rates, and you will receive a credit for any tax you've paid overseas. Now, on the basis that the tax rates overseas are generally quite low, a lot of taxpayers are going to be a lot worse off under these new rules. They will effectively be paying much more tax than they have been doing so in the past. Now, the only real way of not paying Australian tax under the proposed new rules from 1 July 2009 effectively is if you become a non-resident. And becoming a non-resident is not a simple thing. Effectively, non-residency means, if you're an Australian citizen, that you do not have a place of abode. You don't live in Australia, you don't have an attachment to Australia. And this is not easy to establish, and the rules for it are quite complex. Basically, if you live overseas, if you're an Australian citizen, have been there for some time, do not intend returning to Australia for some time, have no real connection here, don't maintain property, family, any real connection with Australia, then non-residency can be established, and effectively you will not have to pay Australian tax on your foreign income. But you need to be very careful that you would meet the conditions for this description of what's known as non-residency, and as a rule of thumb it's not that easy to do. The rules are in the tax law. The ATO website does have information concerning it. For those people affected by this, and from my understanding of the rules that quite a lot of people will be, you need to start looking at, firstly, whether your tax position is going to dramatically change. That may have implications as to the value of the contract you're working under overseas in terms of your employment contract, etc. For those people who believe non-residency is a possibility, you need to look specifically at those rules to see whether in fact non-residency is something that you can establish criteria for, and hence effectively retain an exempt income position from Australian tax law at least. Probably the best place to get this information is from the ATO website. They do have some particularly good information on the question of and the definitions surrounding residency. Thank you.